I woke to the faint glow of dawn filtering through my curtains, but the dream clung to me like a stubborn shadow. My mother's face, so vivid, so impossibly alive, hovered in the gray mist of my memory. Her voice was sharp yet tender, the words repeating themselves in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Beware the new family. Trust your instincts. I sat up, the sheets tangled around my legs, and tried to shake it off. It was just a dream, or so I told myself. But the gnawing unease lingered, a cold presence in my chest that refused to be ignored. Dreams, I had learned long ago, were not always figments. Sometimes they were warnings wrapped in metaphor, and my mother had a way of speaking through the layers of the mind. The apartment was quiet except for the low hum of the heater and the occasional creak of the building settling. The smell of the lingering coffee from the night before still hung in the air, bitter and grounding. I poured myself another cup, letting the warmth seep into my fingers, and tried to focus on the practical. Bills needed to be paid, emails answered, errands run. Reality was a stubborn tether when the heart refused to obey. But even in the mundane rhythm of life, the dream persisted, replaying in my mind's eye. The sharp curve of her eyebrows, the urgency in her gaze, and the soft sigh that seemed to carry both warning and love. I had never felt my mother so insistent in life. She had been gentle, patient, the type to let things unfold, letting me navigate the world with cautious freedom. Yet in this dream, there was a weight, a pressing gravity that I could not dismiss. Later that morning, I received the first subtle sign that something had shifted. The email came from a family lawyer I barely knew, someone my father had mentioned in passing. The subject line was neutral, almost sterile, introduction regarding new arrangements. My stomach tightened as I clicked it open. There was nothing overtly alarming, just a formal tone outlining the upcoming meeting with what they described as a newly merged household and the adjustments to certain trusts and responsibilities. I had a bad feeling, an echo of the dream, but I tried to rationalize it. My family had always been complicated, layered with obligations and unspoken hierarchies. Money and control were never shouted. They were whispered in the corners of rooms, in offhand comments during dinners, in the careful way letters were worded and keys were handed over. Still, something in the phrasing of that email felt deliberate, cold, and carefully measured. The rest of the day passed in a fog of quiet apprehension. I found myself walking through my apartment, touching objects almost compulsively. The framed photo of my mother and me on the porch of her old house, the small brass key to her study that she had given me before she passed, the letter she had written in her careful, looping script. Each item felt like a tether to truth, a reminder that I was not imagining her warnings. By evening, the dream had expanded, leaking into my thoughts in ways I could not contain. I remembered how she had lingered near the doorway of her room, her hand brushing the edges of the furniture as if feeling for something unseen. "Beware the new family," she had said, almost whispering it. Yet the words had carried a resonance that felt heavier than any normal caution. I could almost see her eyes scanning the faces of strangers, measuring intentions, reading motives that I could not yet discern. Dinner was a quiet affair. I sat alone, my fork pushing around my plate more out of habit than hunger. The phone rang once, my father's office, then another number I did not recognize. Both calls went unanswered. My instincts screamed at me to trace them, to understand, but something in me hesitated. Perhaps it was fear, or perhaps it was the strange inertia of grief that had settled in my chest over the years. Later that night, I found myself in front of the mirror, brushing my hair, staring at the reflection that seemed older than it had just hours before. The dream had left me raw, tender, and suspicious of every benign interaction I had taken for granted. Who were they? The new family? What did my mother know that I didn't? The questions circled in my mind like vultures, patient and unrelenting. Sleep came slowly, reluctantly, and when it did, it brought no relief. My mother returned, not in full, but as fragments, her hand reaching out, the whisper of her voice, the careful cadence of warning. And with it, a sense of urgency that I could not shake. It was as if she had passed on more than a message. She had passed on a responsibility when I was only beginning to understand. By the time I woke the next morning, the world felt subtly different, as if a layer of fog had lifted to reveal hidden contours I had never noticed. The apartment, the city, even the people around me carried a latent tension I could not place. And yet, beneath it all, a thread of clarity had emerged. I could not ignore the dream. I could not ignore her warning. I pulled out the letters my mother had left me. Dusty envelopes tied with string, each carefully cataloged in her looping handwriting. One, in particular, stood out, a letter marked with the date she had passed, a final note that felt more urgent than the others. Trust your instincts. There are those who will smile and charm, but not all intentions are pure. Watch, listen, and remember who you are. The family you trust may not be the one who protects you. The words burned on the page, a reminder that I had inherited more than memories. I had inherited vigilance. And as I folded the letter, slipping it back into the envelope, I realized that the path ahead would be lined with subtle manipulations, hidden motives, and psychological games I had yet to understand. The dream had been a catalyst, a spark in a quiet room, and I knew that the days to come would test every ounce of observation and intuition I possessed. Outside, the city lights flickered through the blinds, indifferent to my apprehension. And yet, I felt that I had been given a tool, fragile but potent, my mother's voice, echoing through the corridors of memory, urging me to see beyond appearances, to question charm, to navigate a world that was rarely what it seemed. I was awake now, yes, but more than that, I was alert. And the new family, whoever they were, had no idea how closely I would watch. The following morning, I found myself standing in front of the building where the lawyer had requested we meet. It was an old structure, the kind that smelled faintly of varnish and dust, with walls that had seen more than a century of whispered secrets. I gripped the strap of my bag tightly, the letter from my mother pressed against my chest like a talisman. I didn't know what I would find inside, only that I had to trust her warning. The office smelled of polished wood and leather chairs. There was a faint trace of jasmine from a visitor long gone, or perhaps someone who had lingered too long. The receptionist greeted me with a practiced smile, oblivious to the tension that clung to my shoulders. I signed in and took a seat, my eyes flitting to the framed certificates on the wall, each one a quiet assertion of authority, of control. Then they arrived, a man and a woman, impeccably dressed, moving with a familiarity that immediately unsettled me. Their smiles were bright, too precise, the kind of charm that demanded trust before you even understood the need for caution. My stomach twisted. This had to be them, the new family. My mother's warning surged in my mind. Beware. Trust your instincts. The lawyer, a tall man with thinning gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses, introduced them formally. This is Mr. and Mrs. Latham, he said. They will be joining the household arrangements as per the recent updates. His voice was flat, controlled, and deliberately neutral. I nodded, careful not to show the sudden spike of suspicion that had seized me. Yet inside, 1,000 alarms were blaring. I watched the Lathams closely, noting every flicker of expression, every subtle movement, the way they mirrored each other, the small smirks that passed between them when they thought I wasn't looking. There was a harmony in their gestures that felt practiced, almost rehearsed, and it set my nerves on edge. As the lawyer outlined the formalities, my eyes kept returning to the couple. He spoke of trusts, of household adjustments, of shared responsibilities that would be distributed over the coming months. Everything sounded benign, procedural, yet my gut rebelled. My mother had warned me for a reason, and something about the way this family presented themselves screamed that appearances were deceiving. After the formalities, the Lathams offered pleasantries. Mrs. Latham's voice was soft, almost musical, yet every word felt carefully measured, chosen to create comfort while subtly assessing my reactions. Mr. Latham nodded politely, his gaze never lingering, his charm practiced and precise. I smiled politely in return, but the instinctive unease remained. That night, I couldn't sleep. The apartment felt smaller somehow, the walls closer, as if the dream's shadow had expanded into reality. I paced slowly, the keys to my mother's study clutched in one hand. I could almost feel her presence hovering nearby, urging me to remember, to observe, to question. I pulled out my mother's journals, leafing through the pages carefully. Each entry was a meticulous record of small observations, interactions, and hunches she had cataloged about the people around her. The handwriting trembled slightly in places, betraying emotion she had not wanted to admit. But in each line, there was a through line of vigilance, a subtle insistence that appearances could not be trusted. And then I found it, a letter I had never seen before, tucked between two journal pages. The paper was thin, the ink slightly faded, but the words were unmistakable. There will be those who smile with the gentleness of angels, yet carry knives behind their backs. Watch the Lathams carefully. Their charm is a mask. Protect your sense of self. Do not let their world swallow yours. My chest tightened. The dream, the letter, the unease, all converged into a clarity I could not ignore. It wasn't just a warning. It was a call to vigilance, a call to fortify myself against manipulation I had not yet fully understood. The following days were a delicate dance. The Lathams visited often, each meeting orchestrated to feel casual, natural, yet every detail screamed calculation. They complimented my apartment, inquired gently about my routines, laughed softly at jokes that weren't particularly funny. It was subtle, almost invisible, and I had to remind myself constantly not to be deceived by appearances. One evening, I noticed it, a small discrepancy in their story about a mutual acquaintance. A casual mention of a shared friend, a detail about a dinner I had never attended, names that didn't match up. I felt a ripple of fear and curiosity. Were they lying intentionally, or was it a simple mistake? My mother's voice echoed in my mind. Trust your instincts. I began keeping my own notes, recording every encounter, every inconsistency, every subtle gesture. I documented the laughter, the smiles, the way they positioned themselves in the room, even how the sunlight hit the walls during their visits. It became an almost compulsive ritual, a way to anchor myself in reality while their carefully constructed charm threatened to blur the edges. It was in these moments, alone and observant, that I began to understand the nature of the lie. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't overt. It was psychological, a quiet, insidious reshaping of reality to make me doubt my perceptions. I began to notice small manipulations. The way Mr. Latham would casually suggest I might be misremembering something. The way Mrs. Latham would nod at my statements but subtly reframe events in her next comment. It was as if reality itself was being bent around them, tested and adjusted to their comfort. The realization was suffocating. My mother had not just warned me about strangers. She had warned me about a systematic effort to undermine me, to make me question my own mind. And the Lathams, with all their smiles and practiced warmth, were already in motion, weaving their influence into the spaces I had considered safe. I remember sitting at my kitchen table that night, the journal open, the letters spread around me like shields. The city outside was quiet, indifferent, but inside, the storm raged. I could feel my resolve hardening. The path ahead was not clear, and the Latham's intentions remained obscured, but I would not be passive. I would watch. I would document. I would survive. And I knew, deep down, that the real test had only just begun. The first unmistakable sign came in the mail. A letter, formal and crisp, stamped with a lawyer's seal. I tore it open carefully, my fingers trembling despite my attempts at calm. Inside was an updated schedule of household meetings and responsibilities. But something felt off. Certain events, ones I had expected to attend, were now listed as optional for me. Invitations I had assumed were mine by right were subtly rerouted to the Lathams. The phrasing was courteous but firm, almost surgical in the way it carved out space around them while shrinking mine. I reread the letter 3 times. Each time, the message grew clearer, heavier, insidious. I was being pushed to the periphery, A sense of exclusion crept over me, an almost imperceptible reshaping of my place within a household I had always considered mine in memory and legacy. My mother's warning rang in my ears, louder now than ever. Trust your instincts. That evening, I watched the Lathams move through the apartment as if they owned it. Every gesture was confident, every glance purposeful. They did not speak of the letter or the rearrangements. Instead, they smiled, asked casual questions, and positioned themselves in ways that subtly reinforced my outsider status. It was slow, methodical, almost invisible. I realized, with a creeping chill, that the exclusion was not about anything I had done. It was not about mistakes or errors. It was about control, about narrative. The Lathams were not merely joining the household. They were reshaping it, quietly, psychologically, until my presence felt like a minor disturbance, a detail they could choose to acknowledge or ignore. At first, I questioned myself. Perhaps I had overreacted. Perhaps the changes were procedural, necessary, unavoidable. But instinct has a language all its own, and mine screamed in the quiet moments. Something was being orchestrated, something designed to make me doubt my right to belong. I began documenting again, more obsessively than before. I noted which meetings I was excluded from, who spoke over me, which suggestions were ignored, and which were amplified when coming from the Lathams. I cataloged gestures, glances, and moments of subtle ridicule hidden behind polite smiles. Each note became a lifeline, a way to anchor myself against the encroaching distortion. One evening, the banker called. A routine check on accounts, he said, but the questions were oddly pointed. "Have there been any changes in your living arrangements?" he asked casually, though the undertone hinted at compliance, at verifying what the Lathams were subtly imposing. The conversation ended with perfunctory reassurances, but the implication remained. The machinery of control extended beyond the household, threading through letters, meetings, and authority figures. I started to feel the isolation deeply. Friends who had once been part of these routines were now distant, subtly steered away. Invitations never arrived. Casual calls went unanswered. It was not overt cruelty. It was exclusion performed with the gentleness of diplomacy, the invisibility of a shifting shadow. The world around me seemed to tighten, closing off avenues I had always taken for granted. At night, I returned to my mother's letters and journals. She had cataloged these very dynamics in her meticulous way. Subtle exclusions, the slow assertion of influence by people who appeared benign, the way trust could be manipulated word by word, gesture by gesture. The realization was both frightening and clarifying. This was a familiar pattern, one my mother had recognized long before I had the chance to understand it. In the quiet hours, I found myself wandering through the rooms, running my fingers along the walls, the tables, the bookshelves. Each object became a witness, each key and letter a symbol of continuity and truth. I could almost hear my mother's voice whispering, urging me to observe, to remember, to resist the subtle shaping of reality. The Lathams' presence became increasingly pronounced. They held small gatherings under the guise of casual visits, arranging furniture, suggesting activities, and subtly reshaping routines. I was present but peripheral, involved in formality but excluded from decision-making. Every smile, every nod was a carefully measured maneuver, psychological test of compliance and tolerance. I began noticing the cracks in my own confidence. Their charm worked like a slow drip, questioning my perceptions, my memory, even my instincts. And yet, every time doubt crept in, I returned to the letters, the journals, the memory of her face in the dream. The warnings were no longer abstract. They were a roadmap, guiding me through a world where reality could be bent by those skilled in subtle manipulation. The first direct confrontation came from an unexpected angle. The executor of my mother's estate, a quiet woman with a firm handshake and meticulous manner, asked me to review certain documents. "The family dynamics are delicate," she said carefully, almost cautiously. "It's important to ensure clarity about roles and responsibilities. Her words were kind, measured, but underneath I sensed urgency. Even those sworn to fairness could see the subtle reallocation of power that the Lathams were imposing. For the first time, I understood the depth of their strategy. It was not immediate aggression. It was erasure through politeness, dominance through charm, control through subtlety. The dream, the letters, the intuition, they had all prepared me for this slow revelation. And though the isolation stung, it also sharpened me, forcing me to observe with precision, to note every detail, and to trust the instincts my mother had nurtured in me. By the end of the week, I realized I was navigating a world where inclusion was conditional, where smiles were carefully calibrated, and where my right to belong was questioned in quiet, almost invisible ways. I felt the sting of exclusion in meetings and conversations, in the rearranged routines that made me feel less central, less relevant. And yet, in that sting, there was clarity. I understood who had power, how it was wielded, and how it could be challenged. Not with confrontation, not with melodrama, but with patience, observation, and truth. I returned to my bedroom, sitting by the window as the city lights blinked on one by one. The dream had been a warning, the letter a guide, and now, the reality of exclusion confirmed what I had feared. The Lathams were skilled, yes, but I've been trained by intuition, by memory, and by love to recognize the subtle hand of manipulation. I would endure, I would watch, and I would remember, because in the slow burn of truth, patience would be my weapon, and their charm would be their undoing. The days that followed felt like walking through a room filled with invisible obstacles. Every step, every conversation, every glance carried the weight of subtle scrutiny. The Latham's presence was omnipresent, and their influence seeped into the routines I had once taken for granted. My mother's warning reverberated through my mind, but I had no blueprint for this level of quiet control. Survival, I realized, would demand more than intuition. It would require strategy, patience, and restraint. I began structuring my days with deliberate care. Mornings were spent reviewing correspondence, noting inconsistencies, cataloging every detail of the Latham's visits. Afternoons were dedicated to research, understanding the legal frameworks, the household arrangements, and the ways influence could be exerted subtly through documentation and authority. Nights became reflection periods, where I reviewed my notes, my mother's letters, and the fragments of the dream that still lingered with haunting clarity. The psychological pressure was constant. The Latham smiled, included me in gestures of apparent camaraderie. Yet every move seemed calibrated to remind me that I was peripheral. At first, it made me flinch emotionally, but gradually, I learned to observe without reacting, to endure without conceding. Each subtle exclusion, each polite dismissal became a data point, a map of their influence and intent. One afternoon, I noticed the Lathams organizing the living room differently than usual. The arrangement was innocent to any casual observer, yet to me, it spoke volumes. Chairs angled to direct conversation away from me. Objects subtly relocated to create their claimed spaces. Routines reframed to highlight their control. I wrote it down meticulously, noting the exact positions, times, and interactions. It was tedious, exhausting, but necessary. Observation had become my lifeline. The banker called again, casually mentioning the distribution of certain funds that subtly reinforced the Latham's growing autonomy. "It's all routine," he said lightly. Yet I could detect the underlying assumption that I would accept these changes without question. I did not reply immediately. Instead, I noted the timing, the phrasing, the tone, each detail feeding into the evolving map of their strategy. Isolation was the heaviest burden. Friends' messages went unanswered or were delayed. Casual social invitations faded away. It was not overt malice, but a quiet redirection that left me feeling unmoored. I realized then that survival was not about confrontation. It was about fortifying my sense of self, maintaining clarity, and creating small bastions of reality in a household being reshaped around me. I returned frequently to my mother's journals, One passage stood out. When control is wielded through subtlety, the only defense is observation and endurance. Protect your perception. Protect your memory. The truth is a fortress that cannot be breached by charm alone. Her words felt like a shield, grounding me in reality. I began a system of recording. Letters, photographs, notes, even small sketches of room layouts. Each artifact was a point of reference, a tangible reminder that my perception was valid, my memory intact, my judgment untainted by manipulation. The Lathams, sensing the subtle resistance, began to escalate their charm in smaller increments. Compliments that felt rehearsed, jokes timed to create confusion, gestures intended to disorient. But I had learned to endure, to observe, to survive. My reactions became calculated, measured, even neutral. I spoke when necessary, remained silent when appropriate, and documented every interaction with quiet diligence. One evening, as I sat by the window reviewing my notes, I realized I had shifted into a state of heightened awareness. Survival was no longer just a reaction. It was a deliberate practice. I understood the rhythm of their manipulations, the cadence of their lies, the patterns in their charm. And in that understanding, I found power. Not the power of confrontation, but the power of clarity and patience. The executor of my mother's estate visited again, noting some irregularities in recent arrangements. Her tone was cautious but firm, suggesting a subtle acknowledgement that my observations were valid. Even authority figures were now part of the intricate web, and yet, with careful documentation, I could protect myself against misrepresentation. Each note, each recorded detail, each cataloged discrepancy became armor in the slow game that was unfolding. The apartment, once a sanctuary, had become a battlefield of perception. Every object, the brass key from my mother's study, the framed photos, the letters, was a marker of continuity, a reminder that my reality was legitimate. I placed them carefully, deliberately, creating a mental map of truth amidst the shifting tides of exclusion and charm. By nightfall, exhaustion had set in, but the practice of survival was ingrained. I had become vigilant without paranoia, patient without resignation, resilient without rigidity. My mother's presence, her dream, her letters, her warnings, had transformed from abstract memory into living strategy. And though the Lathams moved with confidence, I had learned to move with awareness. Sleep, when it came, was cautious and light. Dreams returned, but they were no longer frightening. They were guides, fragments of insight, reflections of intuition sharpened by experience. I had entered a mode where survival was not passive endurance, but active engagement, observing, documenting, understanding, and waiting for the subtle cracks that would reveal truth. In the quiet hours before dawn, I sat with my journal, writing in long, deliberate strokes. Every detail mattered. The Latham's gestures, the timing of visits, the shifts in authority figures' behavior. I cataloged patterns, noted inconsistencies, and reinforced my own sense of reality. The house was no longer a space of simple living. It was a psychological arena where patience, observation, and restraint were the only weapons available. And somewhere deep inside, I felt a spark of hope. The Latham's charm was polished, their influence spreading quietly, but it was not infallible. Patience would reveal cracks. Observation would expose lies. The truth, carefully documented, would endure where their carefully constructed facade would eventually falter. I leaned back, closing the journal, listening to the hum of the city outside. Survival was hard, lonely, and exhausting, but it was also clarifying. I was no longer the passive participant of a dream or a memory. I was an active observer, a chronicler of reality, a guardian of truth. And though the Latham's influence stretched through the household like a shadow, I knew that shadows can be traced, measured, and ultimately illuminated. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible. A hesitation in Mr. Latham's smile when he thought I wasn't watching. A flicker of impatience in Mrs. Latham's tone as she recounted a story that didn't quite add up. I noticed it during a dinner that had been carefully orchestrated to make me feel peripheral. The conversation flowed like a river, polite and controlled, but there were small ripples, tiny distortions that betrayed cracks in their otherwise flawless facade. I almost didn't recognize them at first. Years of careful charm, of practiced smiles and measured gestures, had trained me to doubt my own perception. But by this point, survival mode had sharpened every sense. I was alert in ways I hadn't known possible. Every movement, every word, every pause became a clue, a detail to record, a window into reality beneath the carefully constructed veneer. The first significant crack came during a discussion about household arrangements. The Lathams had been detailing a plan for a weekend gathering, framing it as casual, inclusive, innocent. But the phrasing was off. There was a slight misalignment between what they said aloud and the documents I had reviewed. I spoke up, pointing out the discrepancy, careful not to accuse, careful not to react emotionally. "Perhaps you misread it," Mrs. Latham said smoothly, her voice gentle, disarming. I double-checked. I replied evenly, holding the folder steady. "The dates and responsibilities here don't match what was outlined previously." Mr. Latham's charm flickered. Just a brief hesitation, a fraction of a second where his confident posture faltered. It was so slight I almost missed it, but I had trained myself to see these things. Mrs. Latham glanced at him quickly, a micro-expression of irritation passing across her features before her smile returned. That moment, fleeting as it was, confirmed what I had suspected. Their facade was not unbreakable. Over the next few days, I began noticing other signs. Documents misfiled, stories repeated inconsistently, minor contradictions in their interactions with authority figures. The banker called twice with questions that seemed to confirm my observations. Even the executor, a careful, composed woman, hinted at subtle irregularities that suggested the Lathams were not entirely transparent. I started to document everything more rigorously than ever. Photos of letters, notes on conversations, timestamps of visits, even the order in which furniture was moved during their gatherings. Each detail was a thread, and the threads began to weave a pattern, subtle, invisible to most, but visible to me. I was mapping their influence, tracing the cracks that their charm had concealed for so long. The most revealing moment came unexpectedly. I had been reviewing one of the estate documents late at night when I noticed a footnote that didn't match anything I'd seen before. It referenced a transfer of responsibilities to the Lathams that had never been discussed with me. My pulse quickened, but I remained calm. I knew the key was observation, not reaction. The next morning, I approached the lawyer, careful to frame my questions neutrally. "I noticed a discrepancy in this section," I said, presenting the document. "Could you clarify if this was intended?" The lawyer adjusted his glasses, scanning the page. "Ah," he said slowly, tapping the footnote. "This was recently added. There was a procedural oversight in notifying all parties. I'll make sure it's corrected." Relief flickered through me, but so did a grim satisfaction. The crack was widening. The Lathams' attempts to manipulate or control without full transparency were beginning to falter. Their charm, once a smooth and unbroken surface, was showing fissures. I began to notice subtler behaviors too. Mrs. Latham's voice sometimes wavered when repeating certain stories. Mr. Latham occasionally over-explaining, as if trying to cover gaps that had already been exposed. It wasn't dramatic, not yet, but the psychological veneer was thinning. One evening, I reflected on the dream again, on the letters on the journals. The cracks I was now observing in the Lathams' narrative were exactly the type of subtle deceptions my mother had warned about. Her instincts had always been precise, and now, decades later, I was seeing the same patterns in real time. It was almost uncanny. The dream had prepared me for this moment of clarity. I began testing them carefully, asking questions that required them to recall details, making small observations aloud, subtly highlighting inconsistencies without confrontation. Each reaction, each slip, Each fleeting expression was recorded meticulously. I was no longer just surviving. I was engaging in quiet strategy, tracing the weak points in their carefully crafted control. Even the house seemed to respond differently. Rooms that had felt orchestrated for their comfort now became arenas of observation for me. The placement of objects, the timing of gestures, the lighting during their visits, all became data points in a mental map of influence versus reality. The apartment had transformed from a place of subtle oppression into a space of investigation, of psychological reconnaissance. I felt a cautious optimism growing. The Lathams were not invincible. Their control was deliberate but not perfect. Every subtle lie, every manipulation, every misdirection had left behind evidence. And while they had assumed my compliance, my endurance and documentation were steadily undermining their unspoken authority. By the end of the week, I noticed a shift in the atmosphere. The Lathams' movements were slightly less assured, their charm marginally less polished. I observed Mrs. Latham hesitate over a story she had recounted before. Mr. Latham paused mid-gesture. Small, fleeting, almost imperceptible, but to me, the cracks had begun to spread. I returned to my mother's letters that night, rereading her final warning. The truth will always show through. Observe, endure, and record. Those who manipulate will falter, for charm cannot erase consequence. Watch for the cracks. They're the openings to justice. I placed the letter beside my journal, the flickering lamplight casting shadows across the pages. The cracks were no longer subtle shadows. They were openings subtle but real. And I knew, with a clarity I had not felt before, that patience and vigilance would carry me further than confrontation ever could. I slept that night with a sense of cautious triumph. The Lathams' facade, once seamless, had begun to fracture, and though the work ahead was far from over, the first signs of exposure, however small, brought a quiet, deep satisfaction. Survival had shifted into strategy, endurance into quiet advantage. The cracks had appeared, and with them, hope.